Okay, this is the Learning Target 6 notes, which is really two parts. And part one is graphing a absolute value equation. So here's an example. Y equals the absolute value of x plus 2 plus 1. So we're going to graph the equation with an absolute value. Now if we think about absolute values for just a second, when we plug in numbers to an absolute value, sometimes we get a negative in the absolute value. So here's an example. We could plug in negative 4 for x and get negative 4 plus 2. We get a negative 2 in the absolute value. But as soon as you take the absolute value of negative 2, it comes out positive. Similarly, we could plug in a 0 for x. So 0 plus 2, we take the absolute value of 2, and it comes out as positive 2. So what that means is when you plug in a negative 4, which we've already done the work here, we're just talking about the work. When you plug in negative 4, you get 2 plus 1, you get 3. Also, when you plug in a 0, you get absolute value of 2 plus 1, you get 3. So with absolute values, you're going to get what I call a V shape. You're going to get either a V or an upside down V. And you can see that as we graph the points here that I plugged in. Negative 4 gives you 3. Plug in negative 3. You can follow this work. Pause the video if you need to. The absolute value of negative 3 plus 2 turns into the absolute value of negative 1 plus 1, which is 1 plus 1, and so forth. But what we see is at negative 2, 1, it kind of turns around. That's the turning point. Whoops. And when we graph this, we can clear that ink. Still getting used to my functions here. When you graph the point negative 2, 1, and you graph the points that are also around that point according to plugging in these x values, we get that V shape. So with an absolute value, you're going to have, if you're not careful, you're going to be plotting these points or finding these points, and as you plot them, you're thinking, well, it looks like a line. But make sure that you plot enough points that your line turns back around. So now let's talk briefly about when that line will turn around. What is it about an absolute value that's going to make that happen? When does an absolute value start giving you the same output values? Well, here's when that happens. When you have a negative 1 in the absolute value versus a 1 in the absolute value, you're going to still get 1 out of both of those. So if we look a little closer, our turning point will always be when the stuff inside the absolute value becomes 0. So let's think about that. X plus 2. What would make an x plus 2 equal 0? Let's see, x plus 2, if we took x plus 2 and set that equal to 0, subtract 2, get negative 2, which is why we have a table over here centered around x equals negative 2. We plugged in values around x equals negative 2 so that we would see the V shape. So to recap, always look at what's in the absolute value, the x plus 2, and think, what would make that 0? So when you start to make your table, you'll use that value in the middle of the table. So here's a second example of, and this one we did a little less work on in class. But the example is y equals negative 2 absolute value of x. So let's, without looking at that table, think about what would make the absolute value become 0. Well, this time, just putting a 0 where the x is would do that. So I centered my table around x equals 0, plugging in negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2. You can look at these being plugged in and see the points are negative 2, negative 4. The ordered pairs are negative 1, negative 2, 0, 0, etc. When you graph them, you get the V, but you get it upside down. And we talked about in class what might one think would do that. You know, the first time we graphed y equals the absolute value of x plus 2 plus 1. The second time we graphed y equals negative 2 times the absolute value of x. So in class, they came up with what probably turned that upside down was the fact that there was a negative in front of the absolute value, which is exactly what causes that to go upside down. So I'm going to stop the video here at part 1 because that's the graphing the equation part.